Hi. All right, so we are going to get into Detective Wagner. Okay. Whew, take a deep breath. All right, here we go. All right, so the date of this report is July 18th, 2016. We're starting on page 101 of the investigation issued by Carver County Sheriff's Office. On June 28th, 2016 at 8 a.m., Detective Chris Nelson, DEA Task Force Officer Jeff Baller, DEA Task Force Officer Mark Lombardi, and I responded to Moline, Illinois Fire Department at 1630 8th Avenue in Moline, Illinois to interview the EMS paramedics Austin Rands, Justin Fredrickson, Kevin Sorby, and Marco Leon, who were listed in the Moline Fire Department report as the paramedics who treated Prince at the airport during his overdose on April 15, 2016. At 8:26 a.m., DEA Officer Mark Lombardi and I met with Justin David Fredrickson, date of birth redacted, in an office, in an office room at the fire hall. Fredrickson was one of the paramedics who treated Prince during the opiate overdose, overdose on April 15, 2016, and had administered the Narcan medication when Prince's plane made an emergency landing at the Quad Cities airport. Detective Nelson and DEA Officer Voller interviewed Justin Rands and Kevin Sorby in a separate room. During the interview with Fredrickson, we learned that Fredrickson was working the evening of Thursday the 14th into Friday the 15th of April 2016. Fredrickson said he was assigned to Station 3 and Ambulance 13. Fredrickson said sometime during the shift they received an unknown medical problem at the airport. Fredrickson said this was unusual because they typically don't go out to the airport during the night because planes are not scheduled to land overnight. Fredrickson said when they arrived, the plane had already landed and the stairs were already out. He said as he grabbed his gear and a cot, he observed a guy in a black suit carrying a little guy out of the airplane like you would carry a little kid or a baby. Fredrickson described the guy who was carrying the person as a big dude, African-American guy wearing a dark suit, and described also seeing a pretty younger female with light-colored skin who had also exited the plane. DEA Officer Lombardi showed Fredrickson a DVS photo of Kirk Johnson, and Fredrickson confirmed the big dude carrying, who he later identified as Prince, out of the plane was the same person, Kirk Johnson. Fredrickson said that he attempted to go up the stairs to meet them, but Kirk Johnson told them that he would be coming down. Fredrickson said that at first he thought the person that was being carried was an older female because they were wearing glittery gold clothing and shoes. Fredrickson said he had asked the big dude, Johnson, how long she has been unresponsive, and he said he just stopped breathing or he's not breathing good, and that is why they brought the plane down. Fredrickson said as they laid the person down on the cot who was wearing the gold clothing, Fredrickson said he immediately recognized it was Prince and not an older woman because Prince was very distinctive. Fredrickson said he immediately noticed Prince wasn't breathing and believed it to be an opiate overdose. When asked why he came to that conclusion, Fredrickson said that he has been a paramedic for 10 years and has treated numerous patients who have overdosed on an opiate. We asked Fredrickson what he had seen during the initial examination of Prince. Fredrickson described Prince's overall presentation, including respiratory arrest, his pulse, and described Prince's pupils as pinpoint. Fredrickson said he turned to the big black dude, Johnson, and asked, "What did Prince take?" According to Fredrickson, Johnson told Fredrickson, quote, "Sometimes Prince takes a Percocet after a show," end quote. Fredrickson said he asked Kirk, quote, "Are you sure he only took one Percocet?" end quote, but Kirk didn't say anything else. Fredrickson said Kirk's answers were very stoic, short, and didn't volunteer anything unless we asked. Fredrickson said he administered 2 milligrams of Narcan via IV, which seemed pretty ineffective. Fredrickson said he administered 2 milligrams of Narcan via IV, which seemed pretty ineffective. Fredrickson said he was surprised Prince wasn't coming around because 1 milligram will usually wake up a casual opiate user. Heavier users usually wake up with 2 milligrams of Narcan. Fredrickson said he was surprised they weren't getting a response right away, and explained how people usually come around in as fast as 10 seconds. Fredrickson said he administered a 2 milligram Narcan dose via IV for a total of 4 milligrams of Narcan. Fredrickson said it wasn't long after the second dose of 2 milligrams of Narcan that Prince took a large gasp and woke up. Fredrickson said he had asked Prince how he was feeling. Fredrickson said Prince looked up at Fredrickson in almost a confused state and then turned and looked at Kirk Johnson, who was sitting on the bench inside of the ambulance. According to Fredrickson, without Prince saying a word, Kirk Johnson replied, "Prince feels fine." Fredrickson said he thought it was strange how Kirk Johnson spoke for Prince. Fredrickson said his partner Austin Rands asked Prince the question again, "How do you feel, Prince?" And this time Prince answered the paramedic stating, "I feel all fuzzy." Fredrickson said that was the only comment Prince ever made during their interaction. Fredrickson described Prince as being very quiet. Now, before we go too far, I just want to point this out. That we've got 2 paramedics that are giving 2 different renditions of what happened, because no, where did it go? Where did it go? Okay. I'm sorry. I know it's frustrating when I hear it. Well, it's probably, I imagine it's frustrating. Okay. 2, 3. What I'm trying to get to, here it is. Yeah, sorry. All right, so what I was trying to get to, what I was digging for, is I wanted to really display, I guess, what a drastic difference about these 2 Narcan shots with these 2 different paramedics who were there. They were on the scene. And so we've got the one paramedic, the first one, who is Rands, right? And he's saying that They placed Prince on a cot, and they asked Kirk if Prince had taken any drugs, and Kirk said that Prince took one Percocet after his show, and that's when paramedics gave the shot of Narcan, and he immediately took a breath, according to Rands. Rands says that Prince took a big breath after his one shot of Narcan, and according to him, this was a sign of an overdose emergency. After administering the Narcan, Prince's heart rate came back up, and so did his breathing. Then on the way to the hospital, Prince starts to go through convulsions. And so Rands went ahead and administered another round of Narcan. After the second round of Narcan, Prince started to come around, but was not answering questions correctly. So what does that mean? He's confused still? Then one of the paramedics, who goes unnamed, nope, I'm sorry. As the paramedics are pulling into the hospital, Rands looks at Prince and he says, "Prince, how do you feel?" And Prince says, "I feel fuzzy." And at that point, Rands asked Prince one more question, which was, "Do you remember what happened?" And Prince said no. And after that, Kirk took over the situation. So that is Rand's information given to Chris Nelson, Detective Chris Nelson. And then we've got this whole other paramedic who is Fredrickson, and he's saying that he noticed Prince wasn't breathing and believed it to be an overdose of opioids, and that respiratory arrest, he's talking, his pulse, his pupils were pinpoint, and Fredrickson turns to Kirk Johnson and says, "What did Prince take?" And according to Fredrickson, Johnson told Fredrickson, sometimes Prince takes a Percocet after a show. Now that's a whole different thing than what we just got done reading from a whole different paramedic and detective. What we read in Rand's statement is that he asked Kirk if Prince had taken any drugs, and Kirk said Prince took one Percocet after his show. Then we've got Fredrickson saying, "What did Prince take?" to Kirk, and he says, and Kirk says, "Sometimes Prince takes a Percocet after a show." So then Fredrickson says, "Are you sure you only took one Percocet?" And Kirk says nothing. So then Fredrickson goes on to say that he administered to Prince 2 milligrams of Narcan, which seemed pretty ineffective. And that Fredrickson was surprised that Prince wasn't coming around, because usually 1 milligram will wake up a casual opiate user, and heavier users usually wake up with 2 milligrams of Narcan. Fredrickson said he was surprised that they weren't getting a response right away, and explained how people usually come around in as fast as 10 seconds. These are 2 different renditions of what happened. 2 different versions. Alright, so then Fredrickson said he administered a second milligram Narcan dose via IV for a total of 4 milligrams of Narcan now. 4. I'm no nurse, but that sounds like a lot to me. And we're talking about a little body, too. Fredrickson said it wasn't long after the second dose of 2 milligrams of Narcan that Prince took a large gasp and woke up. Fredrickson said he asked Prince how he was feeling. Fredrickson said Prince looked up at Fredrickson in almost a confused state and then turned and looked at Kirk, who was sitting on the bench inside the ambulance. According to Fredrickson, without Prince saying a word, Kirk Johnson replied, "Prince feels fine." Fredrickson said he thought it was strange how Kirk Johnson spoke for Prince. Fredrickson said that his partner Austin Rands asked Prince the question again, "How do you feel, Prince?" And this time, Prince answered the paramedic saying, "I feel all fuzzy." Fredrickson said that was the only comment Prince ever made during their interaction. Fredrickson described Prince as being very quiet. DEA officer Lombardi asked Fredrickson, who was riding in the back of the ambulance while en route to the hospital. Fredrickson said it was his partner Austin Rands, Prince himself, and the bodyguard, describing Kirk Johnson as your typical bodyguard, big guy in a suit. Fredrickson said the young, pretty female who was on the plane rode to the hospital in the ambulance's front seat. Fredrickson said at one point, while they were still at the airport, he had asked the female about Prince's medical history. Fredrickson said the bodyguard, Johnson, chimed in immediately and told Fredrickson that she didn't know anything. Fredrickson said he got the feeling the bodyguard didn't want the female to talk to Fredrickson. DEA officer Lombardi had shown Fredrickson a photo of Judith Hill and asked if she was the female who was with Prince and Kirk Johnson. Fredrickson confirmed the girl to be Judith Hill. Fredrickson told us once at the hospital they requested a private room and transferred Prince to a cot. Fredrickson said Prince never said anything other than the "I feel all fuzzy" comment. I asked Fredrickson if they took any samples from Prince for testing while en route to the hospital. Fredrickson said the only sample they took was a blood glucose reading, which came back within the normal limits. Fredrickson said that sample would have been discarded in the biohazard sharps container. We asked Fredrickson if there was anything else that may be important for our investigation, and Fredrickson said there was nothing else. We ended the interview. End of report. We're just going to keep going. Okay, so date of this report is July 20th, 2016. On Wednesday, June 29th, 2016 at 12:52 p.m., DEA Task Force Officer Mark Lombardi and I met with Donald Edward Wright II, date of birth redacted, in a conference room at the Holiday Inn, Rock Island at 226 17th Street in Rock Island, Illinois. Donald Wright, who goes by the name of Ed, was the primary nurse for Prince while Prince was admitted to the Trinity Rock Island emergency room on April 15th, 2016. Detective Chris Nelson and DEA Task Officer Richard Hand interviewed Pamela Esparza and Kathy Curtis, two additional nurses who treated Prince while at the Trinity Rock Island emergency room. Dr. Nicole Manca, the doctor who treated Prince, was not available for an interview at that time. In speaking with Wright, Wright began by stating that he has worked as an emergency room nurse for the past 3 years. In regards to the night Prince was admitted to the hospital, Wright said that he was the one who answered the radio call from the paramedics around 1 a.m. The call pertained to an unresponsive patient who was getting off a plane at Quad City Airport and paramedics administered Narcan. Wright said once they arrived at the hospital, Wright said he immediately noticed the party being treated was Prince. Wright said Prince was accompanied by a black male, late 40s, approximately my age, bald, in a suit, who presented himself as Prince's manager. Prince was placed in room 22. Wright said they began the triage process, which included screening questions such as, do you have allergies? Well, I wish that I knew the answer to that question, because my understanding is that Prince had an allergy to codeine, the same drug that is in Tylenol 3s, which were prescribed by none other than dentist Sarah Boo to Kirk Johnson on the 14th of April, right before the plane incident that she knew about before it had a chance to be printed in the newspaper, yet she learned about it from the newspaper. Okay. Wright said that they began the triage process, which included screening questions such as, do you have allergies? Have you been out of the country recently? Do you feel like harming yourself? Wright said Prince was the one who answered all of the questions, including the question pertaining to harming himself, which Prince answered no. Wright said Prince was hooked up to monitors during that time, was responsive and stable, but very quiet. Wright said because of the patient being Prince, they kept it very private and limited the number of people who had contact with Prince. Wright said other than himself and Dr. Manka, there was also RN Esparza, Connie Bixby, a patient care tech, and RN Liza Cruz, who would have had contact with Prince that evening. Wright said Connie Bixby and Lisa, and now it's Lisa. Well, Lisa, Liza, whatever her name is, okay, Cruz, RN Cruz, who would have had contact with Prince that evening. Wright said that Connie Bixby and Liza Cruz were only in the room for a very short amount of time and would not have had any information to share and did not have any conversations with Prince. Well, I don't mean to nitpick or anything like that, but who is right to be able to speak on behalf of the other two? Just because they were in there for a very short amount of time doesn't mean that they have nothing to offer, and that kind of wasn't up to him to really make that call, but okay. Okay, so RN Curtis came on during the morning shift to relieve Wright. Wright said Dr. Manka requested a standard set for an overdose, which would have included an EKG, a blood draw, and a urine toxicology screening. Wright said Prince's manager, later identified as Kirk Johnson, and a young, attractive, light-skinned female, believed to be Judith Hill, had stayed in the room with Prince for most of the evening. For most of the evening. Wright said he even got the female a cot so that she could lay down in the room with Prince. Wright said when he went in with the EKG, Prince refused the EKG test. Wright said he and Dr. Manka went into Prince's room 2 to 3 times during the night in an effort to obtain permission from Prince to conduct testing, but Prince continued to refuse all lab draws and testing. I asked if it was Prince who was answering the questions or the manager, and Wright said that Prince was the one who was speaking and denied the testing. Wright said that they explained that they wanted to observe Prince for the 6-hour general monitoring time because administering the Narcan was not always enough to assure that there were no other reactions, and since they didn't know exactly what Prince had ingested because he would not allow them to conduct tests, monitoring him was required. Wright said while he was questioning Prince regarding what he had taken, Prince told Wright that someone gave it to him to relax. And that's in quotes. But Prince never said where he got it from. Wright said Prince never told him what it was. Wright could not recall who gave him a small Ziploc bag which contained a pill that was sent to the pharmacy for testing. Okay, I'm sorry. Let's read that again. Wright said they explained that they wanted to observe Prince for the 6-hour general monitoring time because administering the Narcan was not always enough to assure that there were no other reactions, and since they didn't know exactly what Prince had ingested because he wouldn't allow them to conduct tests, monitoring him was required. Wright said while he was questioning Prince regarding what he had taken, Prince told Wright someone gave it to him to relax, but Prince never said where he got it from. Wright said Prince never told him what it was. Okay, so isn't that the part where Wright asks him questions? I mean, and then Wright could not recall who gave him a small Ziploc bag which contained a pill that was sent to the pharmacy for testing. Why can't he remember that? That's a pretty big deal, I think. That could be the source of where... Okay, we don't remember. Fine. All right. Wright said he believes the pill came from a black bag in Prince's room. Who gave it to you? Who gave it to you, Donald, Ed? Wright said that he thought it was Vicodin. Wright said he could not recall how many pills Prince said he took. What can he remember? So far he's telling us that, you know, those two people who were here for this event are not good sources of information because they were barely around and it was such a short amount of time that nothing could have possibly, you know, been said or done around them that would be of any importance or help in this situation with the investigation at all. And then we've got him not remembering who gave him the pill in the Ziploc baggie or where it came from, but then all of a sudden he's saying, oh, it came from the black bag. And now from the black bag in Prince's room, and that he thought it was Vicodin, Wright thought it was Vicodin, but that he couldn't remember how many pills Prince said he took, but said that what Prince told him was not enough to warrant the use of Narcan. That's a lot to not remember. Okay. Those are some pretty important details that I would think that he would remember. Okay, Wright said it began to be more of a monitoring situation because Prince refused all testing and explained how Prince had nowhere to go because the pilots had left and Prince had to wait for another plane to come pick them up. Wright said Prince and his manager, Kirk Johnson, and the female, Judith Hill, just waited at the hospital for the plane. Wright said his shift that night was 3:30 p.m. to 4 a.m. But Wright elected to stay over until 7:30 a.m. to continue care for Prince and limit the number of people who had contact with Prince for privacy rights. Wright said RN Kathy Curtis came on at 7:30 a.m. to relieve Wright. Wright said he did not know what time Prince was discharged, but said it was sometime after 7:30 a.m. Okay. DEA officer Lombardi asked Wright if the female who was with Prince, Judith Hill, ever said anything to Wright. Wright said the female was very quiet and never said anything other than simple comments such as thank you when Wright would bring in water, the cot, etc. We asked Wright if there was anything else that would be important for our investigation that we didn't already ask. Wright said, nothing that I can think of other than he was very tight-lipped about the whole situation, just kind of gave the impression that other people handle these kinds of things for him. We ended the interview. End of report. All right. So, stay tuned for more with me on Chris Wagner, Detective Chris Wagner, because we've got a lot to get through. That's a lot. This is all one person. All right.